My name is Khadijah Ali Coleman, and I'm going to introduce to you your keynote speaker for tonight. You ready? Yes, ma'am. All right. In 1851, Sojourner Truth, a black woman born enslaved as Isabella Bumfree, gave an extemporaneous speech in Western New York that was to be later known as the Ain't I a Woman speech. In this speech, she loudly and unapologetically stood for women's rights and the rights of the enslaved. "I am as strong as any man that is now," she exclaimed to the crowd of white faces amazed at her boldness and unabashed truth. "As for intellect," she said, "all I can say is if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold." Today, Dr. Stacey Patton carries the torch lit by heroines like Sojourner Truth, who came before her. A journalist, academic, a social justice activist, Dr. Patton has unapologetically used her platform to champion for the underserved, the voiceless, and the disenfranchised. 2 years ago, as a senior reporter for the Chronicle for Higher Education, she wrote the groundbreaking article, "From Welfare to the Tenure Track," that illustrated the lives lived by many adjunct teaching faculty in our schools across the country, living in poverty due to harsh restrictions on class load, pay, and benefits. A child raised in the foster care system and a child abuse survivor, she has been featured on numerous news programs, from NPR to Melissa Harris Perry's show, as a child welfare advocate speaking out on this country's adultist legacy of heralding child abuse as discipline. Her bylines have been featured in local and national publications, including the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun. One of the ways that Dr. Patton continues to make her work and herself accessible to the public is her innovative and daringly open use of social media and her rapport with people all over the world through online platforms to discuss, display, and collaborate. She is the founder of the child advocacy group Spare the Kids Incorporated, which hosts an interactive web portal about raising children in nonviolent ways. And like Sojourner Truth, Dr. Patton has had public vitriol tossed her way for her reluctance in staying quiet on issues that pertain to issues of justice and equality. Like Sojourner Truth, who, when greeted by the young white men with hissing and groaning at a later conference after her Ain't I a Woman speech, replied, "You may hiss as much as you please, but women will get their rights anyway. You can't stop us neither." Dr. Stacey Patton speaks up and allows her work to stay focused on social justice and truth-telling. Dr. Patton is the recipient of the 2015 Vernon Jarrett Medal for Excellence in Journalism from Morgan State University School for Global Journalism and Communication and the Open Society Foundation. She received this award for her coverage on race in academia. She is also the recipient of awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, the William Randolph Hearst Foundation, the National Education Writers Association, and Society of Professional Journalists. In addition to her work as a journalist, she is the author of The Mean Old Yesterday, a memoir, and she is currently working on 2 book projects, Spare the Kids, Why Whipping Children Won't Save Black America, and Strung Up, the lynching of African American children during Jim Crow. Copies of her book will be available for purchase after the banquet, and she will be doing a book signing, and we also will have a Q&A session after her talk, which you can use the microphones that are in the room. So without any further ado, I would like for you to put your hands together and give a warm welcome to academic, journalist, and activist, Dr. Stacey Patton.
Good evening. So did you guys have too much to eat? Because I didn't hear enough gusto with that good evening. Good evening. Oh, now I feel the love. Thank you so much. My brothers, my sisters, I'm so honored to be in this space with you. this evening. I want to start off by asking you all a question. How many of you in this room have ever been to a black church? Raise your hands. Raise them high. Okay, so y'all know how preachers like to get it started, to get you amped up for the sermon. So I want you to all turn to your neighbor and say, "Neighbor, I'm so happy that you are here." Now, I really want you to reach deep down into the depths of your soul and really say it like you mean it. Turn to your other neighbor and say, "Neighbor, I'm so happy that you are here." Now, give yourself and each other a round of applause for being here. We've seen the messages of hate with those teeming hordes of bigots, yahooing and waving that raggedy orange flag under the guise of Southern heritage, a heritage that was meant to exclude people like us from being free, a heritage that made it illegal for people like us to learn how to read and write, let alone gain access to institutions of higher education. The message of devaluation and hate is clear through all those dead black bodies in the street killed by police, 102 in 2014 alone. And according to a piece published earlier this week in the Washington Post, in 2015 so far, one unarmed black person is being killed by police every 9 days. Some of them college students, like 19-year-old Christian Taylor from Angelo State University in Texas, and 21-year-old Matthew Ajibade, who died from blunt force trauma in an isolation cell in Savannah, Georgia. The message has been clear from the judicial system that cleared George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, the same judicial system that declined to charge Darren Wilson for shooting Mike Brown, the same judicial system that said it wouldn't retry Randall Carrick for the shooting death of Jonathan Farrell, the same judicial system that declined to indict Daniel Panatello for choking Eric Garner to death on a city street in broad daylight on camera. The same judicial system that has taken over a year to decide if it wants to indict Timothy Loman, the cop caught on video carrying out a drive-by shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice. The same judicial system that this week declined to indict the officers who handcuffed a mentally ill Natasha McKenna and tasered her over and over again for 2 minutes until she lost consciousness and died. The message of hate and devaluation also ring in the halls of the ivory tower. The message was clear at the University of Oklahoma when a white fraternity sang a racist song about lynching black people. It was clear from Asian, Black, Latino, Native, Muslim, and LGBT students who received backlash after using social media to create an avalanche of blogs, Tumblr pages, and Facebook pages to describe the subtle ways that racial, ethnic, gender, and other stereotypes can play out painfully in an increasingly diverse higher ed atmosphere. Last year, we saw online projects like microaggressions at Brown University, I Too Am Harvard, Being Black at Michigan, I Too Am NYU, I Too Am Oxford, and other projects at Iowa, Berkeley, Princeton, and Notre Dame. We saw die-ins on campuses all across this country. They weren't just talking about the injustice of police brutality in the regular streets. They were also talking about harassment from campus police officers and other types of inequities that they experience. The message is also clear through online attacks and the silencing of faculty of color who have used social media to speak out against racism on campuses. Sadia Grundy, a feminist sociology professor of race at Boston University, and Zandria Robinson, another sociology professor at Rhodes College. The message was clear just last week when a Native student Chitabiah Johnson, a 19-year-old sophomore at Cal State Sacramento University, who was dismissed from her history class after she disagreed with her white male professor's assessment that Native Americans did not face genocide. The professor said she was hijacking his class and was accusing him of bigotry and racism. I too have been the subject of those same attacks whenever I've written about race and racism in my journalism work. I've been called a whore, the B word, the C word, the N word, a gorilla. Trolls like to use my PhD as a slur against me. Here's one of my favorites. You must have gotten your PhD from Walmart. Sometimes they respond by putting quotes around doctor, or tell me that because I've gotten an advanced degree in African American history, that my degree is worthless. And when we defend our humanity in these spaces, our professionalism and decorum is called into question. Brothers and sisters, we are living in an age where nothing is racist to racists except people of color who study, talk, and write about racism. The value of our bodies, our minds, our intellectual labor and contributions, our perspectives, our voices, our achievements, our right to move, to occupy a place, to breathe and exist in this world is constantly being devalued by bigots who dine on narratives about our alleged inferiority, our criminality, our failures, our family pathos, and our citizenship unworthiness in order to define their own identity and to give their lives meaning. We are being devalued by people who hate our success because it does not shore up their own fears and insecurities. They are angry because they cannot effectively use us as demonstration projects to prove the lies they believe about their own inflated sense of superiority and overall awesome sauceness. Hashtag all lives matter. Speaking of hashtags, we are living in a moment of heartbreaking hashtags. I can't breathe. Black lives matter. Say her name. If they gun me down. If I die in police custody. Am I next? Alive while black. But we are also, brothers and sisters, living in a moment of hope and optimism. In a moment that is ripe for change. That is ripe for you, all of you here, to make significant contributions, to become allies and agents of change. We've seen examples of this already. Frustrated with the lack of coverage in the traditional mainstream media and fed up with media bias and demonization, especially when it came to police shootings, we have witnessed the rise of citizen journalism and amped up use of social media by young folks across the color line to highlight the stories of shooting victims and to galvanize people to activism. The killings of Trayvon, Mike Brown, Eric Gardner, Rekia Boyd, Tamir Rice, and others touched off a national debate about policing, criminal justice, and widening inequalities in many aspects of American life. But they also gave birth to new birth of passion and energy to a civil rights movement that has been in the throes of a slow comeback since the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012. That the nation became riveted by the meta story of Ferguson and later the killing of Eric Garner in New York was due in a large part to the work of a loose but increasingly coordinated network of millennial activists, many of them college students just like you. Students who had been beating the drum for the past few years. In 2014, the new social justice movement became a force that the political mainstream and global community is now reckoning with. This re-energized millennial movement with tech-savvy activists differs from its half-century-old civil rights era forebearer in a number of important ways. This moment is driven far more by social media and hashtags than marches and open-air rallies. This new social justice grassroots movement reflects a broader agenda that includes LGBT issues and immigration reform. It is decentralized and leaderful, as the activists like to say. These young grassroots activists have a broad suite of concerns: the school-to-prison pipeline, body cameras for police, community policing, housing equity, educational inequality, food and transportation access, student loan reform, safe play spaces for young people, the over-policing of Black and Latino communities, and an end to deportations. In essence, they're trying to take on deeply entrenched discrimination that is fueled less by showy bigotry than systemic implicit biases. Young scholars, historians, social scientists, folks in public health and other disciplines are adding racial analysis to the mix, using their research to offer sound critiques and solutions that can inform policy decisions. This movement's renewal has exposed also a serious generational rift. The current movement is a bottom-up movement being led by young unknowns who have rejected, in some cases angrily, the presumption of leadership thrust on them by veterans like Reverend Al Sharpton and Reverend Jesse Jackson. They are not turning to the traditional civil rights organizations, which some regard as feckless virtue rackets that have sold out their communities for corporate dollars. And they reject the politics of respectability and the call that they must politely ask, "Excuse me, sir, will you please add 'Stop Killing Us' to your campaign agenda?" While both the younger and older activists both trace their lineage to the civil rights movement, these contemporary tensions are updates of the disagreements that marked the earlier movement. But what we are witnessing now is a prologue of a new human rights drama that you will be part of. The younger movement is not about mobilizing people for rallies and speeches around a single male leader or preacher in a suit. The mobilization is not happening in churches. The younger activists are embracing a grassroots model and in which agency is widely diffused. These young people are embracing participatory democracy, which notably resists naming leaders or spokespeople. Think about the optics of the Black women activists who recently publicly confronted powerful white men like Bernie Sanders at his own political rally. Their actions are certainly unprecedented. These young women pushed aside a history where Black women have been denied access to the political stage, a place where white male politicians routinely demonized and chastised Black women as bad mothers and welfare queens driving up the national debt, who regularly denounced their cultural influence as disputable and immoral. These Black women snatched the mic, owned the stage, and made clear who was in charge, followed up with a hashtag, "Bow down, Bernie." While eschewing white fragility in favor of Black survival, Black Lives Matter activists are also challenging Black people's hang-ups around queer leadership, around women's roles and respectability politics. We are seeing a new paradigm of Black women's leadership. Historically, Black women have been expected to be the support for the leadership of Black men, doing everything from serving food to carrying out the details of the organization. But today, these women are in leadership roles, and they're tossing aside gendered expectations of how roles are supposed to be fulfilled. Now they are doing the work, and they are the face and voice of the movement. The politics of respectability, which required male clergy leaders, have been pushed aside. The walls of a media that sought after those leaders and credentials have been kicked over by this group of black women who are not calling press conferences or asking for permission to speak at the microphone, but snatching it without care or concern for the optics. For this generation, there are no worries about airing dirty laundry or reinforcing stereotypes. These activists are literally fighting for their lives, and they could care less who they make feel uncomfortable in the process. Black Lives Matter has made clear over and over again that its tactics don't cater to our critics' feelings. It is no wonder that these disruptions, their attempts to change the narrative and the demands to be heard has prompted so much backlash from those who say they support Black lives, but on their own terms. As the election season approaches, we can be sure that these young activists will make themselves heard as loudly as ever, and they will demand that candidates include their policy issues on their agenda. But we must also take note that some of these activists are not deeply concerned about engaging in the political process because they see the state as the very tool that is killing them. Some of these young activists are now talking about how to be self-reliant and self-sufficient and doing what's necessary to protect and preserve their own lives and the lives of their communities. They are using their energies, their talents, their voices, and their research to achieve these goals. So, brothers and sisters, again, when I say that I'm happy to be here in this space with you, it's because I understand the power of the political work that your bodies alone perform on your campuses, in the classroom, in the lab, in the dorm, the athletic field, in student governments, in your activism, and in your home communities. And I see your potential and the potential that your intellectual labor has in helping to upend this unholy, sinister, racist, capitalist paradigm that's trying to destroy us all. Like many of you here, I too was a first-generation college student. And I was the first to attend graduate school and to earn an advanced degree in my family. When I look back on my personal path to the PhD, I realized that by all measurements and predictions, that I was not supposed to become Dr. Stacey Patton. I was not supposed to become a journalist, an author, and an activist. I, like legions of other benighted young people living in this country, was expected to live a life of voicelessness in the shadows of obscurity and forever intellectually disabled. That was the plan. My life began as case number KC 114343 in the New Jersey foster care system. I was told that my single mom of 4 kids took her life at age 25. My father walked out of my life when I was an infant. I was then adopted by a fiercely religious black couple who believed in the philosophy of spare the rod, spoil the child. Like so many black parents, they beat me out of fear. It was the kind of fear that we saw on display during the Baltimore riots a few months ago when Toya Graham plucked her teenage son out of the crowd for throwing rocks at the police. She told the world that she didn't want her son to be another Freddie Gray. This is a cry heard by generations of black parents who've been so traumatized and terrorized by racism that they believe that assaulting their children is effective, life-saving parenting. Far too many of us believe that whipping children will save them from the streets, from a police beating, from the morgue, from ending up in prison. But if whipping our children was so effective, then why are we having a national conversation about mass incarceration? If whipping black children were a prerequisite for success, then black people should be ruling this country right now. Unfortunately, my adoptive mother's violent parenting tactics fed me to the foster care system at age 12. It was my experience growing up in an abusive home, in a culture that embraces and celebrates whooping kids, and then spending my teen years in the foster care system that sowed the seeds for my passion and interest in childhood studies and child welfare, juvenile justice, and the intersections of race and parenting in America when I entered graduate school. During my 4th year of my PhD program at Rutgers University, I published a memoir that examines the historical roots of corporal punishment in Black families. And then I decided to write a dissertation about the historical devaluation of Black childhood during Jim Crow, about how racists, embryologists, pediatricians, psychologists, social scientists, law enforcement officials, artists, teachers, and others involved in the child study movement of the early 20th century seized the life stages of childhood, embryonic development, the moment of birth, infancy, adolescence, and puberty, and racialized these developmental milestones and use them to shape policies around medical practice, education, child welfare, and juvenile justice. My work is about the denial of innocence to young people of color, how our current misunderstandings and demonization of young people of color in this country is rooted in a past where they were intentionally viewed as indistinguishable from adults. That's why Trayvon Martin was referred to as a man instead of a scared teenager being stalked on his way home with a bag of Skittles and iced tea. That's why police officers mistook 12-year-old Tamir Rice for a 20-year-old man. As a Black child, I felt like my peers and I, growing up in the 1990s, were a problem to everyone. The message was everywhere. I needed to understand these ideas and the treatment that informed the fears that informed how our parents and community treated us and talked about us. To do this work, I entered college and graduate school, holding on to my story, to my experiences, to my sensitivity about what it meant to be vulnerable, voiceless, powerless, different, and an outsider. As a Black child, I was taught to stay in my place, to be seen and unheard, to speak when spoken to answer only when called. And so the only thing I had control over was my mind and my education. Like the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass and the writer Richard Wright, reading and writing and educating myself was the path to a new identity beyond case number KC 114343, beyond child abuse victim, beyond foster kid. Despite all their flaws, my adoptive parents told me to go as high as you can go, get all the degrees that you can because no one can ever take them away from you. They also told me that if I ever wanted to be anything in this country, that I had to be twice as good as white people. I believed them then, but now after so many years of navigating all white spaces as a student, as a professor, and as a journalist, I resent that twice as good message because it was a lie. I need you all to abandon that message because it's a burden. It suggests that we have, to some degree, accepted the racist idea that we are starting from a place of being less than or inferior. I resent the message because living up to that credo, twice as good, while navigating my academic and professional career has been a burden that has required code switching, watching my tone, writing with anxiety about how my truths will be perceived, questioning whether I'm good enough, whether my voice is a problem, letting other people's standards and judgments and narrow vision guide my pen. It has required me to make my presence and my work palatable to others. It has required efforts to make myself feel safe. All of this extra labor for so long has foreclosed opportunities for me to achieve the kind of emotional and intellectual freedom that I need to do a greater spiritual work to help my people who are pushed to the margins of life get free. I recently left the Chronicle of Higher Education as a senior enterprise reporter so that I can be free and stand here on this stage tonight and give you some unedited real talk without fear of consequence. I have accepted that there will be those who will struggle with my authenticity, as you will find to be true as well. Being a first-generation student came with its challenges. Feeling like an outsider or an intruder on campus, not feeling intelligent enough, having my sense of self-worth caught up in somebody else's measuring tape, dealing with microaggressions from professors and students, dealing with the hurts and slights from family members who don't seem to value intellectual labor as real work and who seem to resent me. And family members who seem to resent me for leaving and getting an education to improve my life. You got book smarts, but you think that you're all that because you got a PhD? You think you know everything? You so-called intellectual? You ain't a real doctor. What you gonna do with a PhD in history? Why don't you get a real job instead of wasting all your time in graduate school reading books? At my graduation party, I heard, Stacey, you know what a PhD really stands for? BS piled high and deep. And once I received my PhD, I felt weird about hearing people call me doctor. I actually cringed. I felt embarrassed. I didn't want people to think that I was better than other folks. So I found myself playing down my accomplishments to prove that I was down to earth, that I could hang, that I could keep it real. When I went on the job market, I sat at the table in all-white organizations where no one else on staff had a PhD. And I watched the hiring folks flip through my extensive CV and shake their heads in disbelief at all that I had accomplished. They didn't quite know what to do with me. I even debated whether I should take the PhD off my CV to make my highly educated self less offensive to people who had not themselves earned an advanced degree. I thought that this was maybe all just me, just in my mind, until I came to the Chronicle and started covering graduate education and faculty life. I heard similar stories from other academics all across the country. As a reporter, I got to see the other side of academe. I wrote about the growing numbers of PhDs on welfare, most of them white and female. I received a lot of backlash for that story because it totally disturbed the whole black welfare queen narrative that folks still like to embrace. I wrote about what it was like for first-generation graduate students to go home for the holidays and have to deal with the slights and jokes from family members who don't understand the work that they do. I've written about discrimination of LGBT scholars and even fat professors who face discrimination in the classroom. I've talked with scores of faculty who do work on race and are told that their work lacks rigor. I wrote a piece a few years ago about Black Studies PhDs at Northwestern University. The lead of the story was Northwestern University's first crop of Black Studies PhDs were not baptized in the fire of racial politics. And then, a week later, my own newsroom made a huge gaffe when they allowed one of our white bloggers to write a piece with a headline that read, "The best case for eliminating Black studies, just read the dissertations." It caused a national controversy that went on for nearly a month in the press and on social media. As a journalist, I have committed myself unapologetically to writing stories from the bottom up about people of color, about poor white people who are marginalized as well, disabled people, children. I decided that I would give voices to those groups who have traditionally been presented as data points, as problems, as victims, as long-suffering. At the Chronicle, I refused to write stories about how students of color had persistently bad retention rates, how they were ill prepared for college and grad school, about pathos and dysfunction and blah, 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 blah. Because my studies as a historian helped me understand that a racist system requires that the media feed the public these types of stories. My duty as a historian, as a journalist, as a child activist, is to always present the counter-narrative in whatever space I find myself in. It is to use my skills, my research training, the lessons from my mentors, the collaborations with my peers, to challenge structural inequalities wherever they present themselves. Has this mission gotten me into trouble? Yeah, of course it has. But my brothers and my sisters, when you reach a place of emotional freedom and you understand that you are here for a greater spiritual mission and you submit to that mission without fear, there's really nothing that can stand in your way. This is not hyperbole, it's not poetic language. This is the mindset. It's the kind of soul that is necessary for leadership and for change. Don't ever underestimate the value of your contributions, the power of your voice, and your intellectual labor in this process. When I entered boarding school as a foster kid with my belongings packed in green garbage bags, when I entered Johns Hopkins University and then NYU as an undergrad, when I decided to pursue a PhD at Rutgers University, when I started my first job as a 19-year-old cub reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and then the Washington Post, and then later the Chronicle of Higher Education, I decided that it was my job to do race work. I understood that I survived a childhood of abandonment and abuse to be a voice for those who can't find the words. This required me to hold on to my own personal stories, to never forget where I came from, to not forget my challenges, to not be embarrassed about my origins, to reject some of the messages and lessons that I received from both sides of the color line, to learn empathy, to reject the idea that other people were twice as good as me because of their complexion, to love my skin, my people, my culture, my history, to embrace allies across the color line and mentors who get it and who see a reflection of their humanity and people like me, people like you. My story, like your own individual journeys, kept me humble, kept me real, reminded me of the rare opportunities that I had to seize and the responsibility that comes with it. So many students across this country are bridging their personal and educational experiences with the movements that are happening on and off campuses. Higher education was not invented for people like us. We were never meant to be here. And so our resistance, our accomplishments, our efforts to get free is a long historical process. People opened the doors for me. They opened them for us. And we must continue to do the same through the production of knowledge every time you pick up a pen. The great French writer Voltaire said, "To hold a pen is to be at war with those who devalue us, at those who question our humanity, at war with those who don't want equality, at those who want to turn back on progress. To hold a pen is to be at war." My brothers, my sisters, as I look at each of you this evening, I want you to know that I expect mass casualties. Thank you. So I'm told we'll have a Q&A. Don't be shy. Any questions you might have about graduate school, about anything? Someone in the back? Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
So my name is Eden.
I'm Taylor.
And do you want to joint ask it?
Sure.
You guys doing a duet question?
Yeah.
I mean, we were just thinking the same thing.
Yeah. So it was the portion about you talking about the whipping, and not whippings, but whipping children, and how you sort of tied that to why we don't have, or why we're not successful today. And I was thinking what made, or did you also think about the systematic
And
racism?
structural, processes
Right.
that affect why we aren't ruling the world, other than just the idea. I get the idea, what you were trying to say, the idea that we're getting whooped, and that's if that was the reason, if you were whooping us to rule the world, and we're not ruling the world, but what about all the systematic and structural processes that are blocking us from
Achieving that situation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an important question. There are structural realities, but whipping our children is not the way to get rid of those structural, problems. Part of my work as a historian was looking at the historical roots of how this type of child rearing practice got implanted in our culture through the plantation experience. And then later during Jim Crow, when black children lost their economic value as property. So now you could lynch them. They were worthless. And so it became very dangerous. If you stepped out of line, you could be killed as a child. You could be lynched. And so a lot of black parents over the generations have raised their children from a place of fear. And so we really believe in our culture that part of responsible black parenting is to be harsh with your kids, to prepare them for the harsh realities of, racism in this country. They can't be soft. They have to be strong. They have to survive. But here's the problem. Last year alone, 375 black children were killed by their parents as a result of physical abuse. Many of those children are under age 4. And the biggest killers of black children are black women, age 40 and under. And so we live in a culture of people who joke about this, who preach about it, who embrace it publicly, who celebrate it, and it's actually amping up, the risk for children to be killed, to enter the foster care system. We have the highest rates of foster care placement. Our kids stay in the system longer. The foster care system is becoming a feeder to the juvenile justice pipeline. In California alone, 70% of adult prisoners have had contact with foster care. So, we have these structural problems, but we can't be co-conspirators in feeding our kids to these traps. And so we need to change the conversation. We need to change the way we talk about it from within the culture and give people solutions, to engage pediatricians and public health folks in the psychological community, the folks who are doing that work to change behavior.
Right. So you're making the tie with abusing the child or beating the child with them going into the foster system and then therefore being within the system and then being jailed?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's what you're connecting. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a recent study that showed that in New York, actually, 50% of teenagers who are in juvenile custody have brain damage. Not because they were in accidents, but because science has shown that when you beat your kid, the hormonal rushes of oxytocin and cortisol actually alter the architecture of the brain. So many of these kids have 30% less brain matter than those kids who are not hit. And so they have aggressive behavior, emotional issues that are getting them in trouble, suspended from school. They're getting into fights, they're being violent, and so on. So we have to start making these connections between the science of the brain and, educating people on the ground in real talk about, the risk that they're setting their kids up for. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I also wanted to say thanks for highlighting and pushing up Black women. So.
Thank you. It's a great question. Don't be shy.
We all family. We all family. Hello. My name is Ivy Smith. I am the project coordinator of the McNair Scholars Program at Binghamton University. So my question for you is, can you talk to us a little bit more about how you navigated your PhD experience? From my own narrative and many of my students' narratives, it's very hard on the mental psyche when you are at dominantly white institutions. You sometimes are the only one in class. Sometimes they ask questions that are, oh, well, I can't speak for all the brown people in the room. I can't do that. But it's just very taxing on the soul and on the mind. So I wanted to know if you could give some of these young folks in here who are definitely more than scholars and our next, group of people who are going to do great things, to give them kind of some tips on that.
So that's a great question. I mean, I was prepared well before I got to grad school on how to be the only one. As I said, I was a foster kid who ended up in a predominantly white, very wealthy boarding school near Princeton. It's called the Lawrenceville School. And that was a huge shock for me. I sat in classrooms every day and feeling unwelcome. Just the little slights, the body language, the condescension, things like that from students and teachers, was real. And but I knew I couldn't blow the opportunity by cutting somebody across the table, because I'd be back in foster care or juvie. It was hard. It was very difficult, because then you're sitting at the table and somebody has said something really sideways, and you're like, I know that didn't sound right, and I didn't have the language and the education to come back at them with the facts. I didn't read the kind of books that they read. I wasn't prepared, so that was very frustrating for me. And there were a few, in my class of 250 students, there were 10 African Americans. And in all our social spaces, we just hung together. We shared stories. We talked about what was happening. We, validated each other. And, we said, you're not crazy. I know what you mean. And so we seized those moments to collaborate and to support each other. And we had mentors on the faculty who got it. And so when I got to Johns Hopkins, I was like, okay, I've seen this before. And, and then NYU, I had black professors for the first time. I'd never had a black professor. And so they took me under their wings, and they told me, you have to do the work. You can't get mad. You can't come in there thinking that you're going to dismantle this system overnight. Your job is to get your degree and to do the work. Don't sit at the table twisting your neck and yelling at folks, because then people could just dismiss you as crazy. So I sought out the faculty members who, gave me great advice, who helped me navigate academe, and, those social networks of people who I could collaborate. And sometimes it required me, particularly when I was at Johns Hopkins, to go off campus, to come to UMBC, to come to Morgan, to go to step shows where I could see some people of color, other than the janitors and the groundskeepers, because that was the situation at Hopkins. So by the time I got to grad school, I was already primed for all of this, and I didn't live on campus. So it was a different kind of experience. I lived in Brooklyn and traveled to New Jersey. So I was grown. I had a life. I'm like, I'm going to class, and then I'm going to go to this party, or I got to go read, or what. I didn't have time to be caught up in those things. That's not to say that there weren't these very tense moments in our seminars when these issues came up. But, I had practice watching other minority faculty speak about issues, to do presentations, to see how they handled, audiences, trolls in the audience, basically. And I would watch them. I say, ooh, I want to be just like her when I, get my mind right. And so I started practicing it. And so by the time I got to grad school, it was like playing ping pong. And anytime they would come at me with something, I'd be like, right back at you, back at you, back at you. And I don't even have to yell. And so I just practiced it over and over again. I watched how other people, handled things. I watched debates and constantly read and was always prepared and over-prepared. Teaching was a challenge at first for me because I looked like I was 12 going into, the classroom at 23 years old. So my students were only a few years younger than me. So I struggled with, okay, how are they going to take me seriously? And I had a white professor, very cool dude named Rudolph Bell, who took me aside and he says, listen, I'm going to give you some advice. He says, I'm a white man. Nobody's going to challenge me in the classroom. But you're going to have all kind of issues because you're young, you're female, and you're black. So I'm going to teach you how to neutralize all of that to make sure it doesn't become the focus. Not to change who you are, not to deny what you are, but to give you some tips and tools about how to step into the classroom with confidence. And so every semester, when I would walk into my class of maybe 40 students, mostly white, the room would get really quiet. And the black students would be like, oh yeah, we got a sister up in here. This is going to be fun, And so different populations reacted differently. And so I always started off with a story. I wrote my name on the board, Professor Patton, and I told him the story of a young white male at the end of one semester who came up to me and he said, I have a confession to make. When I enrolled in your class, American History, and I saw Patton as the instructor, I thought, what a cool last name for a history professor. So I expected the great-grandson of General George Patton to walk in wearing a helmet and a flap jacket, but instead walked in this young black woman with dreadlocks. And I sat there and I thought, where's the real professor? And so I thanked him for sharing that. And I shared that story at the beginning of every semester. Because I said, listen, I'm not an aging, balding white dude. There's nothing wrong with aging, balding white dudes. But I am young. Last I checked, female. And, I'm going to bring a different tone and flavor to this class. And you were going to have people who, come at you and challenge you in the classroom because you don't fit, their idea of what a professor actually looks like. My course evaluations are always interesting. She's articulate. Well, what did you expect? She knows her stuff. They just let anybody get up at the podium and talk about the American Revolution. She has a chip on her shoulder. She's opinionated. So you deal with those types of, microaggressions. But after a while, I just developed, a thick skin. You have to get through it. You have to get your head down, get your work done, submit to that larger spiritual mission. And when you have those kinds of responses from people at the table and to your work on social media, that's when you know you're really doing a good job, because evolution hurts. Okay? And I have this thing, when you're doing your research, I call it reversing the gaze or performing a return to sender. So when people come at you with their issues, their projections, it's like, okay. So let me give you that right back. Here you go. Lay it right there. And you do your work. You just get the work done.
Thank you so much.